Hello YouTube, I'm here to review DeLillo's Underworld. I've thought about how to follow up my first review, and I thought that the best thing I could do is review the book I read alongside with a sailor who fell from grace with a sea. It took me a long time to finish this book as I was doing a semester of I was studying as a philosophy student, and I was reading it pretty casually just because I wanted to read it, and I didn't really expect to spend 4 months reading it. Mostly on weekends and like a couple of pages on the weekdays, but I started plowing through it, much more meaningfully after I finished my semester or when I had more free time. It's a very long book, not too long, but by today's standards, it's pretty long. It's about 800 pages. It's considered to be Don DeLillo's magnum opus and a culmination of his golden period. Sometime between like mid 80s when he published White Noise, that catapulted him to success, to the mid 90s, 1997, when he published Underworld. Now it's very difficult for me to review this book, and I've kind of hesitated choosing this book to review because I thought there are many other books I could use to review that I have much more clear thoughts on because it took me such a long time to read. I didn't remember everything, and as I reached the last half of the book, there are a lot of parts of the first half I forgot or I felt like I had to go back to, but couldn't really go back to properly to connect all the dots together. So Underworld is a book that spans the about 40, 50 years roughly of American life from 1950s to the 90s when it was published, and it's mostly revolves around the life of Nick Shea, a waste disposal executive, like someone who's someone who's involved in a company that manages with waste, and different members of his family. But it also has a large cast of characters. There's most of whom are like not necessarily minor, but in the mid range, who pop up intermittently throughout the novel. And there's some parts of the book, especially I think part five. There's what is it called? Part five. There's a certain part where every chapter is like a small snippet of a random person's life, and it's not really made clear if the person whose life is being told about is actually a main character or not, or if it's someone that's just a random person from that time. And I honestly had very mixed feeling about this book when I started reading it, the first few hundred pages, and as I was reading reviews on Goodreads, I felt like I might have been wasting my time because it's a lot of people say it's overrated, and I hate to you know uh, mention people on Goodreads because I know, but the thing is, I know very few people who read on DeLillo, much less Underworld, but I felt a bit apprehensive because it's a long book, and there are only so many books you can read in your lifetime, and yeah, I felt like I was wasting my time, but I was glad I stuck to it. It's the kind of book I think you should read if you really feel a special connection to that book, in that you read it just for the sake of the prose, or for the sake of like, not because you're expecting it to pay off in some way, but because it writes about something that a time and a place, and a certain group of characters that you're kind of not able to find anywhere else, and it writes about not just certain cast of characters in a certain time and place, but also it writes about how certain political historical events from the mid 20th century onward affect the lives of people. I think this is the key strength of the book. It says this on the blurb that Nick Shea and Clara Sachs knew each other once intimately, and they meet up again in the American desert. He's trying to outdistance himself from the crucial events of his early life, She's an artist who has made a blood struggle for independence. Underworld is a story of men and women together and apart, seen in deep, clear detail and in stadium-sized panoramas, shattered throughout by overarching conflict of the Cold War. It is a novel that accepts every challenge of the extraordinary times. Don DeLillo's greatest and most powerful work of fiction. Now, yeah, it's the blurb. It doesn't really give you the whole story, and that's the point. I'm not supposed to spoil it. But I kind of thought it was just like a summary to kind of get you to read the book, but I realized that as I finished the book, it's kind of fairly accurate. And I would say that the whole spirit or structure of the book could be summarized just from the first three paragraphs of the book, which I loved, especially the first sentence. And let me read it. He speaks in your voice, American, and there's a shine in his eye that's halfway hopeful. It's a school day, sure, but he's nowhere near the classroom. He wants to be here instead, standing in the shadow of this old rust hulk of a structure, and it's hard to blame him. This metropolis of steel and concrete, and flaky paint, and cropped grass, and an enormous Chesterfield packs aslant on the scoreboards, a couple of cigarettes jutting from each. Longing on a large scale is what makes history. This is just a kid with a local yearning, but he's part of an assembling crowd, anonymous thousands of the buses and trains, people in narrow columns tramping over the swing bridge above the river. And even if they are not a migration or revolution, some vast shaking of the soul, they bring with them the body heat of great city and their own small reveries and desperations. The unseen something that haunts the day, men of fedoras and sailors and shore leave, the stray tumble of the thoughts going to a game. And it's I think the first time, I think it's just the first page itself is what drew me to keep on reading the book, because I felt as long as I keep reading, I'll come across passages like that, and I did. There are a lot of passages in the book. I just, it's not just I didn't bother to search them and mark them so I can read, but it just, I think it's very subjective, but I think when you reach it, you're grateful you made it this far in the book, even though there are parts that seem flat and they drag on and meaningless, especially dialogue, which is not DeLillo's strength. So, um, on with the plot. So this might be disappointing, but the plot is a bit thin, almost non-existent, and this is one of the key criticisms of the book. Even though I would say in his defense, the plot is not really his concern in most of his best books. I would say only Libra is a book I've read of his that had thing closest to a coherent plot. But if it but the plot's mostly this baseball that's caught by a young African American kid in the middle of a game, and somehow this ball makes its way across, like eventually goes through the hands of different people and makes its way across the main character, Nick Shea. And through a very novel structure, which begins with it's event 1950, where the kid gets the ball at this big game between the Dodgers and the Yankees, I think. I should know this, but it's the Dodgers and the Giants. Dodgers and the Giants. So from this event onward, it starts in 1950. The novel starts then with Nick's life, part one of the book, and then goes back to the 80s, then to the 70s and 60s until it reaches the period right after the events of the prologue. And I would say that it's the structure that got me. I really like that you have to read hundreds of pages to find out the chronology, but and then which is a bit, and this is what was kind of frustrating, is that I realized even with this like backward linear chronology, that the plot is not linear. It's just like sprawling mass of characters that you find out are interlinked in like the most subtle or like uh, I guess tangent ways. I don't know, you have to make the connections, and it gets frustrating because you might like stop caring about their characters or names, so you might get lost. But for me, it was just like I was reading for the prose and the atmosphere of the time, especially the way characters thought about things like the Cold War, the space exploration, and this fear of nuclear war, which was I think only dissolved until the 90s, 1990 when the Soviet Union dissolved, and even then I guess there was different kinds of feelings of paranoia. Um, so I would say like the weakness of the book is maybe a lack of plot, which is like I was which is like would discourage I think most readers, seasoned readers even, if you want a good read, I guess. But I would say it is a above average book. It's not my favorite DeLillo book, although it is much better than most books I've read. So I would say go and read it if you have a taste for DeLillo postmodernism or Americana. And this is a very American book. I don't want to go too much into plot again because there's not too much plot, and if what little plot there is left, I think it's your job as a reader to enjoy it for yourself because sometimes plot's not enough, no matter how well crafted it is. Um, there's not much else to say, except that what I kind of liked about this book, but didn't really grasp until like halfway through, is that this book is like a culmination of like the three major works that I wrote for Underworld. Um, a lot of the themes he explores in his books are kind of combined in this. I felt that this the consumerism and saturated, media saturation depicted in white noise, the terrorism politics portrayed in Mao II, and the Cold War and historical events happening in Libra were all kind of enmeshed in Underworld. They were all there, and I was thinking that like this is an ambitious work even for a writer of DeLillo's standard, and I want to phrase this very carefully. The impression I got is that DeLillo wanted to write a novel in which he didn't care about the form of he didn't care about his own standards. I felt like he just wanted to write his heart out, because a lot of his books are tightly packed, tightly like they have their own structure, and I felt like he put a lot of effort not just the prose but in the structure of the book and made sure there are no loose ends, and if there are, it's just very poetic and mystical and lyrical. But this book, he leaves a lot of loose ends, and I found that very shocking for a guy who writes some of the most like he writes almost like a mathematician to me, a mathematician that just wants to describe the world through words. If that makes sense. Um, okay, and finally, I like this. The only thing I like about this book more about his other books is that it is his most personal book, and I think this is something I read, about his book before I started reading it. That he gives his characters like he puts a lot of heart in his characters, and his characters are actually more human in this book than his other books. And this is another main criticism of Bill, in that he doesn't flesh out his characters as human beings. If you read White Noise, it's almost like watching satirical cartoon. There's no heart to what his main characters say and do. It's all like they're all vehicles to express his ideas. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry for not giving a very I'm not giving a review that's like encouraging you guys to read this. I'm sorry if it doesn't sound like I'm not praising this book enough. I feel like I should be more honest than uh, you know I should be more honest about like what I think about the books I read and about not just like blindly praise them, because I don't think that like the book reviewer should just encourage people to read whatever they like, and I don't think that we should review only books that we like, because that's like gives you a very narrow range of things to work with. And but that's not to say that I don't like this book. I think it's a very special book. I don't think I will ever read a book like this in a long time, not because of its length, but because of its complexity and the impression it left on me. It really is immersive once you get into it, and it's very good at taking you to a time and place you've never been to, and that's probably only exists in the minds and hearts of people who've lived that uh, lived that time. All right, thank you. That'll be all for this review. Apologies for the glare in my back. I'm trying to record my reviews in the daytime for better lighting. See you guys. Keep reading.